Okay. So for the first round, I talked about how Kafka explores how physical difference or more superficial things about a person can alienate them from a group. So Gregor's family keeps toying with the idea if he could understand us, they could find common ground. That was on page 52. They could find common ground and live in peace. However, his family finally decided that because Gregor does not resemble a human anymore, it doesn't they can't associate with him. They don't recognize him as the person they once knew. Um, they can not communicate with him in any way. They have to kind of give up on recognizing him as a person. So this Gregor's isolation also stems from his inability to communicate with his family. So this inevitably leads to his neglect, as he can't, communicate his needs. So he becomes covered in dust. The apple rots in his skin and causes an infection, and it just creates an increasing gap between him and his family.
I talked about how, like, in the beginning of the book, even, like, before his transformation, he sort of felt isolated, like, from the rest of his family. He was always traveling. He never really had any friends, so he didn't really have any connections to society, like, besides his family. And then he was, like, never able to find a wife, and the book kind of hints at, like, marriage is, like, really important at the end when it talks about how his sister would be, like, eventually, like, able to marry someone because she's, like, approaching that age. So he didn't really have anyone. And I sort of thought one thing that really, like, demonstrated his, like, increasing isolation was whenever they, like, remove the furniture from the room, because the room is, like, literally becoming more empty, so he's, like, more alone in his room, but also it's sort of like removing a connection that connected him from his, like, humanity in the past, so he's becoming, like, more of the bug. And then he's also, like, locked in the room away from the rest of his family, so he's sort of, like, locked off from the rest of the outside world. So, like, I think there's, like, a lot of different ways he experiences that, and then I think he's, like, further isolated as a bug.
I talked about isolation with the theme of comparing isolation versus love and like how the isolation affects love. And so he is isolated even from the ones that he loves and the ones that had loved him. For example, his mom really wants to come see him, but she's like afraid of him, and so she's kind of alienating him, and that's shadowing over the love that she has for him, because typically a mother's love is seen as unconditional, but hers is seeming like conditional because he's being alienated. But also the isolation is a two-way road. He also isolates himself. For example, when the door is open during, like, when the family's talking and they open the door for him, he doesn't come out, and that's isolating himself even more. And he isolates himself because he knows that society tells us to act differently to people that are alienated, and especially in the time that the book is written. And so if he comes out, he knows that it'll just hurt his relationships with his family more as opposed to help them.
It's interesting. So going back to that idea of like isolation and love, there's a cliche that says distance makes the heart grow fonder.
Cliches.
I love my cliches. So, in regards to this story, in the beginning, that seemed to hold true because the more he was away from his house, the more fondly his memories were, or even the farther from the past you grow, the more fond your memories are, and the more nostalgic you are towards certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But why does that never seem to come up in the present, or when you're able to solve the problem? When they have the choice to help Gregor or to continue isolating him, why do they always choose the isolation, that path, instead of a living path?
Maybe they were used to the distance that they had between them, and so to come back and see all this change too was just a lot that they weren't used to. They were used to loving him from far. They weren't used to him being right there.
Yeah, because he was always gone. So in the beginning, it's not like they were a super tight family. He was sort of providing something for them. And it didn't really seem like there was a lot of love except for between him and his sister.
Yeah.
Should we go around two?
Yeah, I can start this one. So one thing that I talked about a lot was the apple, and I sort of thought that there were two different things that this could represent. So first, since his dad literally throws it at him, it can sort of represent the abuse from his family, and it can sort of represent how his family doesn't care about him because it starts to rot away. But at the same time, the apple stuck to him. The book kind of mentioned this, also serves as a reminder to his family that he is human. So I think it's kind of interesting that the apple rots away as his family becomes more and more sick of Gregor being there. Sort of shows how Gregor's becoming more distant from his family. And another thing I talked about a bit is his dad's coat, because his dad is like always wearing the same uniform and it's always like buttoned up. And I think it sort of serves as a symbol for like how stagnant the family has become since like Gregor's turned into a bug. They don't really seem to be going anywhere, and like not too much is happening like in their lives because they're just like doing the same thing over and over again, like trying to get by. Um, and then like one other thing I talked about a bit was like the picture on the wall sort of like symbolizes him literally trying to like hold down his humanity from like the rest of his family being able to take it.
So for my symbol, I first looked at the personal alienation and the fact of his deadening job, and for a symbol, I chose a person. So I thought that his boss, that comes to see him at the very beginning of the story, acts as a symbol, and he comes right to his house and almost invites himself in, which shows the power difference and the power struggle that Gregor is dealing with. And it shows that like Gregor is so low that in his job that he just kind of gets thrown around, and he just like he's kind of thrown around in the rest of his book, he's seen more as an object for his family that they're afraid of rather than like a person that actually has feelings, like how they don't even talk to him, they just talk about him. And then for another symbol, I talked about the sheet that he hides under, and he tries to hide himself and disappear, but he does it more for his family in an attempt to love them. So it's almost like he's making the room safe for his family as opposed to making the room safe for himself.
Okay, so one of the symbols I talked about was his desk in his bedroom. When Gregor was explaining the significance of it, he talked about how he used it during his working days, all the hours that he spent during business school, and then during his high school years, all the hours he spent doing homework on it, and so how such a ordinary everyday object has so much meaning to a person's thought process and humanity and education, and so that kind of led to his alienation. The desk created his education, and by becoming more human, more educated, he in fact became more alienated from his family. So Gregor's increased alienation from his family also increased later in the book when he tries to act more human as a bug. So every time, but when he finally gave in to acting like a bug, he experienced this unexplicable joy when he was climbing around the walls. And so this could symbolize Kafka's belief that humanity brings people more harm than good through stresses of daily life and conforming, especially when it comes to how you should succeed in life.
So one thing that you guys both kind of talked about is you talked about how the sheet was a symbol that protected his family from him, and Gregor used it to protect his family. And then you talked about how his desk sort of isolates Gregor from his family at the expense of Gregor because he's always studying there, but at the same time he that's what he studies from, does his work at, so brings them economic well-being. So it seems there's this theme of Gregor sort of sacrificing himself for the family's greater good. You guys noticed that?
Yeah.
100%, yeah. And that role you could kind of say is almost a generational thing, because what you were talking about with Mr. Sampson's uniform kind of being the symbol for a working man and for a working job, it kind of it sets him apart from everybody else in the household because he was always choosing to wear his uniform, whether he was resting, sleeping, or whatever.
And also I feel another cliche kind of is that the love never goes away, and so when the love that his parents are giving him is maybe diminishing, it's making his love for his parents increase to try to even it out again. Okay, so the third one is for the allegory. In Spanish right now we're studying immigration, so I have that I was thinking about that while I was reading this, and how I saw it was kind of one part is before immigrating and then one part would be after the immigration. So before Gregor, he's just seen as a normal person. He makes money, but he's not anything special in his job. No one pays much attention to him, but he's not really dealing with any problems. He's just there. But then after he metamorphosizes, or after he changes, he's seen completely differently, and people are afraid of him, or they don't want to talk to him or help him. Similarly, with how it's a problem kind of right now, or it has been a problem in the past, that immigrants are seen as like bad, or people are afraid to talk to them because they aren't able to communicate with them very well. Just like how Gregor thinks he's communicating with his family, but in reality he is unable to do so because he's kind of like speaking a different language in a way. And this kind of brings up a theme of like fear of the unknown in a way.
So I thought that this book really like served to criticize like the connection that people are like experiencing between each other in society, in like a lot of ways the way that relates to like how much time you're spending at work. Because like Gregor spends all this time as like a traveling salesman, and he's like always working for the betterment of his family, but he doesn't really know anybody like outside of his family, and he doesn't really like have any other outside connections. So then I think like his transformation into like the bug sort of like represents like what he's like already experiencing and feeling on the inside before he has this transformation, and like this just further like isolates him from everybody else, because then after that like his connection, or like he's no longer like interacting with other people, and then after that I think his family like sort of starts to like turn on him in a way, and that's sort of like supposed to explain the lack of connection that he had beforehand with his family because he was never really with them. So I think that what Kafka's like sort of trying to show is that like in society today, people really like are spending too much time like away from other people, and there's not this sort of like interpersonal connection that we need to have.
So I took a little bit more of a political lens on it. So I was saying, I said that people are inadvertently alienating themselves by acting more like themselves. So the more you act the way you want, the more you express who you really are, the more you will find resistance in other people. When looking at this time period and where he was in Prague during a time when it was probably more communist. It was like Eastern Europe. It was very like uniform in terms of the way people thought politically, and so his job being a salesman kind of represents like a more capitalist perspective, looking out for your own well-being, trying to like make as much profit as possible so that you can provide for your family. So being that kind of a capitalist figure in like a more communist like Eastern Europe society will bring you a lot of resistance and like end up getting you killed by like some way or another. But looking at that in more like of a modern context, we could talk about like the gay rights or the transgender rights movements, and how as more people are coming out of the closet, like as this is becoming more acceptable, like across the United States and across the world, you're finding just as much resistance to these people, probably even more than there was before, because there's more awareness of the issue and there's more just access to information.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how what you were talking about can be related to both the time period that it was written and now. It shows that it is like a timeless book.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there are a lot of different ways that this book could be interpreted that make it timeless.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, like I think that like this, like all three of the things that we talked about are things that like definitely apply to like today. Like I think like a lot of people like sort of lose like actual physical connections, like what I was talking about, and, like are connected through like technology and stuff,
right,
which like isn't really the same. And like we definitely like obviously have immigration problems, and then like obviously yours is like political, so it's like super up to date.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Are we like good on time?
I can never tell. I always forget.
I think
I think it was like 12. It was like 12:50.
Yeah,
that you started. So
I can start the next one. Okay, so I chose to look at this book through like a Marxist lens, and I thought that like this sort of demonstrated how like the higher classes are always completely in charge. Before Gregor's like transformation, he was like sort of the breadwinner in his family. He was like very clearly like in charge, and he seemed to have like all the power, and his family was like completely reliant on him. And then, however, like whenever he changes, one thing that I thought was interesting is his boss like comes to his house and he like tries to get into his room. So I sort of like thought that this would demonstrate how like economic forces and like capitalist forces are literally like entering into your home and trying to influence how you live your life, even when you're not like doing something like working, because like the burdens and stuff like that of having to like go like make money and stuff like that have such long-lasting effects on people. But then after Gregor changes and like becomes the bug, and he's no longer like the breadwinner in the family, he sort of becomes subservient. And as he's like less productive for his family, they sort of like push him to the side because he's like no longer a contributing member.
Nice. I approached it through a psychological lens, and so I saw it as more of he was either suffering with like a mental illness or a mental disease or something that was kind of skewing his thoughts a little bit. And so he's suffering and unable to communicate with anyone, which is seen through like him trying to communicate and him trying to actually talk, but they don't understand him at all. And he's confused and he needs like loving care, but the others are uneducated of like what's happening to him, so they're unable to help him. And so I thought of that maybe it was like a cry to help from the author, showing in like a simplified way what's happening to him mentally, in an attempt to educate others and in an attempt to like show them that the problem can be solved in other ways than it is being solved right now.
So I approached this through a biblical lens. So the first like parallel between Gregor and Jesus is they suffered at the expense of others. So in John's chapter 12 through 16, Christ tells the apostles that he must leave, for he knows he only has a few days to live, and that by dying he will benefit them more than he has in life or than he will in life. And so this is seen at the end of the story when almost by command Gregor dies after he gets in a huge fight with his family, and his family says we must get rid of him, there's nothing more we can do. He dies to benefit his family so that they can like move forward in the rest of their lives. So another kind of parallel between these two is that he's accepted by the outcasts, and he also accepts the outcasts in this social hierarchy of people. So it's the cleaning lady who initially is like not repulsed by him, and who he can find common ground with, and like almost a more human interaction with. And so what I think Kafka's trying to say through this story is that you just need to be more human, and you just need to kind of accept everybody. So let's see. How can we tie these three together if we can, or like?
I feel like they're all kind of about human suffering in some way, which I mean is like what the story is about.
Mm-hmm.
But like maybe from that we could gather a theme of like human suffering in ways that they like hadn't believed were possible.
Ooh,
like they didn't know. Like in Metamorphosis, he obviously had never gone through something like this, and like no one ever had, so he didn't know how to go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of can be applied to all of our lenses as well.
And like another thing that I thought was kind of interesting, like both of our like analysis he's more of like a victim, whereas in like your analysis, like he's like still a victim, but he's also like an actor, like using like his like ability to like help others. So I feel like yours like takes a view of him as like having more control than ours does, because like the capitalist lens or the Marxist lens, he's like mainly like a victim of the system.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's time.